Welcome back to the Dynasty Around YouTube channel. Today, I'm bringing you my top 24 IDP rankings to get you ready for the 2021 fantasy football season. We're going to get to those right now. Like I said, today we're diving into my top 24 IDP positional rankings. If we're meeting for the first time, my name is Bob Van, IDP Man. You can find me at @BobVan_IDP on Twitter. Feel free to connect with me there. My DMs are always open. Real quick, before we dive into the rankings, I do want to dive into some logistics, things you need to be aware of in your league specifically. Things you want to be aware of are positional designations. They vary from platform to platform, between my fantasy league, between Sleeper, between ESPN, Yahoo, even. A lot of players line up differently, and it's really annoying. So it's something that you really need to pay attention to in your leagues. Some leagues have TJ Watt as purely a linebacker, where other leagues have him linebacker and defensive lineman eligible. Things like that you really need to pay attention to because it really changes the value of a player if the scoring settings don't accommodate for that player being a different position. So I mentioned scoring. You're going to want to be very comfortable and familiar with the scoring settings in your league. It'll really dictate how and when you attack IDPs in your draft and how you treat them on the waiver wire, trades, etc. Same goes for roster settings. You're going to want to be very aware of how many you're starting per week. If you're starting a lot, you're going to want to attack them sooner in drafts. You're going to want to weigh more heavily on them on the waiver wire, in trades, etc. I did do a video covering this exact topic. Feel free to check that out up here. But hopefully after you're done watching this video, I'll also link that one down in the description box for you. As a small note, these are all the IDP positions included. So linebacker, safety, defensive back, corner, defensive line, defensive tackle are all in this. So it's not one position by any means. So say maybe your favorite defensive lineman prospect this year isn't listed. Doesn't mean I don't rate them highly as a defensive lineman. They just didn't make the top 24. For my full IDP rankings, you can check that out in the description box below as well. I will link that there. They are free at fantasy6pack.net. You can check them out there. I do hope you stick around for the rest of the video as I'll be diving into each of these players a little more specifically and why I have them ranked there. But that is it for boring logistics, and let's kick it to player number one, and that is Darius Leonard. So, I mean, what more is there to say? I know there is some argument between him and Devin White at the number one spot these days. And as a disclaimer, Devin White is number two, so we'll get to him. But, he's a stud guy, good defense. I would say there are some injury concerns, but I think he's looking to have even more responsibility this year than he has in past years. With Anthony Walker out, I'm somebody that believes in Bobby Okereke, but I just don't know that he's going to take a ton away from Darius Leonard as opposed to what Walker was doing. So I think that could leave a little more meat on the bones of production. So with Walker out of the picture, I do think that leaves Okereke with a potential breakout possibility, especially in deeper leagues. He might be a guy that you want to target a little more heavily. But I do think that Darius Leonard is a guy who he's a guy you can draft pretty early and be pretty comfortable with him as your LB1 and kind of, not punt the position, but if you do choose to spend that high pick on an elite linebacker like Darius Leonard or Devin White, it does, and continue that trend at each position, it does kind of give you a lot of viability down the road of who you can draft. You can kind of not punt the position, but as you get further down rankings, tiers get bigger and bigger and wider. So it's one of those things where, if you're set at the top of your position, you can kind of leave that position alone for a little bit. Moving on to number two, Devin White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, LB2, another stud on a good defense, and he's one of the elite playmakers in the league, between sacks, between tackles for loss, forced fumbles, interceptions even. This guy is an absolute animal. We have had some injury concerns, but not nearly as much as like a Darius Leonard who's had like concussions, whereas Devin White has had a knee issue or two, along with some soft tissue issues. But no real concerns for Devin White. And honestly, if you're somebody who is further in the Devin White train or the Darius Leonard, I say take your pick. These are both very good linebackers, and I'm in the camp of these guys are 1A and 1B for me. I just put Darius Leonard at the top just for having a more solidified spot in the league at this point. Just got absolutely broken off, paid as the highest paid linebacker. Between those two, I'm really close. I don't think there's a lot of disparity between the two. Like I said, if you're drafting one ahead of the other, a couple spots either way, I think, and if say you want Devin White, but you end up with Darius Leonard or vice versa, it's a good consolation prize either way you look at it. So moving on to number three, and that is Roquan Smith of the Chicago Bears. I do think there's an opportunity for this Chicago defense to have somewhat of a revival. The last couple years, we've seen them decline, especially like midway through the season. And I think a lot of that boils down to them just feeling like they don't have a chance. It seems like they could get all the three and outs in the world, and it just, what's our offense going to do with the ball anyway? And it just seemed like the effort level just tanked, especially later half of the season. So I think hopefully with Justin Fields, somebody who can maybe put that offense on his back a little bit and actually produce and put points on the board to where the Chicago defense doesn't have to keep the score below 10 points for the Chicago offense to have a chance of keeping up. I think there's a good chance that we could see a revival. And I think Roquan Smith is going to be good either way, but I do think that defense has a bit more of a shot to really show out and be what they've been on paper for so long. That brings us to my number 4 player. That's Zach Cunningham of the Houston Texans. And what more is there to say about this defense that it's probably going to be garbage? I don't like to necessarily target when it comes to the high performers of players that are just on bad defenses. I think that's bad process. But when it comes to this guy, a really good player playing on a bad defense, more than likely, it could be a defense that surprises us. I don't see it happening, but a guy who does a lot on limited snaps. So they did lose Bernardrick McKinney, which I think is more than anything going to open up more opportunity for Zach Cunningham to probably have to play more snaps. He usually only plays like 75% of the snaps. So now I think that could get an uptick because they're just going to have to rely on him more. But he's been super efficient in the snaps he has had. So maybe it's something that stays low. They did bring in Christian Kirksey to kind of make up for Bernard McKinney leaving. As a Packer fan who tried to watch Christian Kirksey kind of have a revival of sorts, I don't see it happening. I think he's going to be a guy who maybe if he's healthy, he's around. If you want like a sleeper linebacker to draft, and this is a little bonus on top of the rankings, is check out Garrett Wallow, TCU linebacker, drafted real late, I believe. I want to say in like the 6th round, but he's slotted in at like the LB2, second stringer. Who knows what's going to come of it, but I don't necessarily see Christian Kirksey staying healthy or that viable in that defense. So he could be somebody that I could honestly see bench one way or another. I think they're going to want to see what they have in that defense because let's be honest, I don't think they're competing this year. There's the whole mess with Watson going on still. So that offense probably isn't going to be good either. Just a mess in Houston, and that makes for a defense that's going to be on the field for a lot of snaps. And so I'm keeping all my Zach Cunningham shares. I already have a ton. I was somebody that originally bought in more on Bernardrick McKinney when they were still kind of both new in the league. And unfortunately, I hitched my wagon to the wrong horse and things fell off their wagon. So I went and acquired as much of Zach Cunningham as I could. And now I'm sitting here with a ton of leagues with Zach Cunningham, and I'm pretty happy about it. Moving on to number 5, and that is Bobby Wagner, linebacker of the Seattle Seahawks. So we start off with 5 linebackers, and IDP leagues are linebacker heavy. They're more centric of a focus. They have a more safe tackle floor, and a lot of them make a lot of plays too. So it's just naturally going to be that way. Obviously, kind of like I said, adjust accordingly. If you're starting a lot of DLs as opposed to linebackers, you want to focus on DLs or safeties, whatever the case is. Talking about Bobby Wagner, and this pains me to say because he's one of my favorite players of all time. I do think that we're starting to kind of see a chink in the armor of Bobby Wagner, and I do think we're going to kind of see him start to age out of the league and age more and more out of his prime. I think he has a year or two left where he's an LB1, fringe LB2, and I think after that, it's going to be time for him to pass the torch. It could be him passing the torch to Jamal Adams, honestly, to lead and head that defense and be that presence. It could be Jordan Brooks. I lean more towards Jamal Adams at this point just because Jamal Adams is already a stud. But Bobby Wagner's still at least good for this year. I think you're seeing the wear on the tires, but just an elite linebacker all in all. One of the headiest players in the league at linebacker. So I'm happy to see him still kicking around and doing well. As a huge fan, I hope he sticks around forever, but just not how the league rolls, unfortunately. Now moving on to number 6, and that's Blake Martinez, linebacker on the New York Giants. As a former Packer fan, it infuriates me to see Blake Martinez doing so well on the Giants. And not only doing so well on the Giants, because he was good on the Packers as an IDP too, but my big issue with that is he wasn't like a good real life player and a good IDP player on the Packers. And whether or not that's Mike Pettin, whether or not that's Dom Keepers, whoever our coordinator was that year. But the fact that he's now on the Giants and a good linebacker is just so infuriating to me. But again, he's the driver of that Giants defense who has shown out to be really good so far under Joe Judge. I don't think he's anywhere near heading towards a slump in his career. I will say, I think his contract is not that long. I think it's only got a year or two left on it. I think it was a pretty modest contract to begin with. So he could be heading into a contract year, so he's going to want to play out. I don't know. They don't really have anybody else to take up the mantle there, in my opinion, at this point in time. So I think there's a chance that Blake Martinez could be on the move, but I think they lean towards re-signing him. He's been a lot better of a player overall. That, along with the fact that there's no one to really take up the mantle for him yet, I think, and that could change with a draft pick. Who knows? It doesn't take a whole lot these days. Depending on if I think they're picking early in the draft. I think they might be looking at quarterback. No offense to Daniel Jones or the Giants fans out there, but sorry, I don't think he's it. But so Blake Martinez, I don't really have any concerns with. He doesn't, have much of an injury history at all. I think he's had a couple of concussions, but nothing super consistent where he's been out for games and games on end due to concussions. So moving on to my number 7 IDP ranking, and we hit our first safety of the board, and that is the aforementioned Jamal Adams. Now, Jamal Adams coming to Seattle was, a crazy move in general for the Jets. They made out like bandits on that deal, in my opinion, but I think Seattle got a true stud and somebody that they will look to make a corner piece of that defense for a very long time. And they solidified that notion with making him the highest paid safety in the league. And I think they've kind of found a perfect role for him. I think when he was in New York, Jamal Adams was set to cover too much, and that's just not really his game. His game is playing a dominant box safety, getting in the mix of things, getting behind the line quickly, running down running backs from behind, from the other side of the line. That was one of my favorite plays last year when he came up from behind the line and just got right behind the guy and took him down before he could make the play and get the touchdown. But, I think they found an absolute cheat code on that defense almost at safety where he plays like he plays that box safety, but he plays, outside linebacker, D end, he lines up everywhere except deep. And that's probably for the best more often than not. But I think they found a perfect place for him in that, a guy who I want to say led their team in sacks and definitely led all safeties and DBs in sacks last year and set a record if I'm not mistaken. He did miss some time with a groin injury, I believe, and that's not ideal, but he hasn't had much of an injury history before that leading into that year. So I think coming into this year, he's fine. He should be good to go. Injuries can happen, but I'm not anywhere near worried about him, and he's pretty solidly my DB1. My number 8 IDP is Alex Singleton, linebacker of the Philadelphia Eagles. And this is going to be a lot higher than I think a lot of people have him, but people really underestimate the effect he had on that defense when he took the field as a starter. His tackle rates were really high. He made plays on the ball. He was pretty much all over the place. He was one of the highest tacklers on the team. And, for a guy who didn't play the full season, did pretty pretty well. Another thing that I like to note with him is that they didn't bring in anybody really substantial in that linebacker room. They did bring in Eric Wilson, who I think will have a pretty significant role, but they only paid him like $3 million. I think he's a starter. It's more of a prove it contract to me than anything else to see if the lightning in a bottle year that he had in Minnesota last year was really anything at all, or if it was just that lightning in a bottle. So I do expect Eric Wilson to have a role, although I think Singleton will be the high tackler, high playmaker, whereas Wilson will be not necessarily just related to coverage, but I think he has some upside too as a deep, probably an LB3 in a lot of leagues, LB4 ideally. But so I am pretty dang high on Alex Singleton this year. I think he's set to set the world on fire. I know that Mike and Pork, two of our resident Philly fans here at the Dynasty Rewind, are very excited for him. And it warms my heart to see two non-real IDP guys get excited about a defensive player. So that is about why I'm pretty high on him. The tackle rates, the fact that they didn't bring in anybody, they obviously feel pretty confident in the guy. So I'm cool with rolling with Alex Singleton at my number 8 IDP overall, which, like I said, I'm taking a stand on the guy, but hey, you got to do what you got to do. Speaking of taking a stand, and that is with my number 9 IDP ranking, and that is Zaven Collins, Arizona Cardinals linebacker. Now, this is the highest I have a rookie ranked this year, and not even really close. I don't have any other rookie in this top 24 list, full disclosure. But you look at what Jordan Hicks did 2 years ago on the Arizona defense, and he was in LB1 discussions for depending on what your league scoring was, but he had a resurgence in Arizona, like just astronomical perspective wise from a stats perspective and just what he did to that defense. But now I wasn't super high on Devin Collins, and he's still technically my rookie LB2. I do want more of Micah Parsons at this point. I think, over the long haul, I think Micah Parsons will be the guy to own, but Ben Collins just has a better opportunity right now, in my opinion. The fact that they gave him the play calling duties right off the rip basically the day after the draft, they said, "Yep, Zaven Collins is our play caller, and Jordan Hicks has the right to seek a trade." And while a crap move, Cardinals, that's pretty not cool. But the fact that they just outright said, whereas last year they drafted Isaiah Simmons even higher, they drafted Isaiah Simmons at pick 8. Never said that. They basically said, you know what? No, you're going to be groomed slowly and brought along very slowly and barely get any role until Devondre Campbell gets hurt. Then you can have a game and you blow up and you do really well. And then continue to not have that role the rest of the season, which is kind of lame, but whatever. The fact that they committed to Zaven Collins so early to basically, hey, you are going to be the guy on our defense. Like, it is going to be you. That tells me a lot, and I think we can expect that type of Jordan Hicks-esque season as long as Zaven Collins is healthy and doesn't see a suspension for any of the off-season antics he's gotten himself into, which I don't think would happen at this point. It was like a month and a half or 2 months ago now, so I'm not too overly concerned at this point. So that is probably the hottest take on this list, is having Zaven Collins as my IDP 9 overall. And now we're moving on to number 9, his teammate Budda Baker. Honestly, I don't think there's anything negative to say. I think there's concerns that, now that he has Isaiah Simmons in front of him, along with Zaven Collins, is there a concern with how much role there's going to be for him? And I think originally I think yes. But honestly, I think no, because I think they're going to be able to use Budda Baker in so many ways. He's a guy who can actually play some coverage, but he's also a good tackler. His tackle for is huge. And then he does make plays from time to time. He's not a huge interception guy. He just had his first interception last year after 3+ years in the league. So with Budda Baker, I think the usage he's going to get and just the flexibility he's going to have, he's going to be able to basically roam the field and do whatever he wants. And I think that's going to be an interesting part of that defense, and I think it's going to be part of something that makes that defense really exciting to watch this year. And now we get into our first player caveat at IDP 11, and that's TJ Watt. And the reason I call it a caveat is because I have him ranked at IDP 11 as a defensive end. And so he's technically my DN1. However, in a lot of leagues, he's only a linebacker. And honestly, I don't think he would have made this list if he's solely a linebacker in a lot of scoring settings. If you're using IDP 123, that's a setting he's still very viable in. But if you're using, say, Yahoo standard settings, which is a very light scoring setting, man, it really just hurts defensive linemen that are listed as linebackers in a lot of leagues, like specifically Yahoo and MFL. So it is something of note that, like, hey, if he's a linebacker in your league and that's it, chill out unless your scoring settings are very friendly. But if he is listed as a DN, I am very comfortable with this ranking of him in pretty much any scoring setting. I do think DNs get a little bit of a boost because they are so kind of top heavy. There's like 6, 7, 8, maybe really good ones. And then the rest are all, there's kind of like a maybe tier, kind of like tight ends, how they line up, where it's like 3, and then there's 3 to 5 maybes, and then there's the rest. Essentially, that's very similar how DNs line up, a little deeper, but still not great. Stud defensive end, sack monster, tackle for loss, tackles, basically everything you want in a defensive end. No injury concerns to speak of. So I'm in on TJ Watt at IDP 11, not overly concerned with anything. I can't stress this enough. Be very aware of the positional designation in your league, because depending on the scoring settings, it can really mess things up for you. Moving on to number 12, and that is Joe Schobert, now a Pittsburgh Steeler. He's somebody I honestly, like, before I did this video, I put down to like 17th overall, and it's just kind of usually how I act when it comes to a player moving teams. I usually downgrade them automatically. There's not a ton of situations where a player goes to another team and it's like, yeah, they get an upgrade, but I bumped him back up to number 12. And a lot of that is because if there's a system that Joe Show should shine in, it's really the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, because they use their linebackers more aggressively than anybody. They blitz their linebackers darn near more than anybody, and they use them a lot in run coverage and run stoppage. So when it comes to that, I mean, what more do you want? And I think Joe Show is probably darn near one of the headiest players in the league. And I know I said this about Bobby Wagner too, but I think it's probably Wagner, and then it's probably Schobert. And I'm probably going to catch heat for that. But, if there's anybody that's, Kuechly-esque with their brain and how they use it, I think Joe Show and Bobby Wagner are darn near him. But he obviously hasn't had the same year or career path as Luke Kuechly. I do think that there's a lot of potential where, he's probably the lowest ranked linebacker right now that I could see hitting linebacker one. And I just think there's a lot of upside for him. He's only listed at LB9. So I think there's not a lot of players past this point where I'm like, yeah, there's definitely a chance. Moving on to number 13, oddly enough, and that's Miles Jack, who has been left by Joe Schobert to be the guy essentially in Jacksonville. And I think now more than ever, there's a good chance that he could be the guy that everybody's wanted Miles Jack to be forever and really break out into that top five, top 10 conversation. Whereas he's kind of not been able to get there. I think everybody likes Miles Jack, but when it comes down to it, like what he actually does, it just never manifests itself. I will say another good kind of sleeper grab, Damian Wilson, expected to be the guy next to him. I think there's a good role there. I don't expect that defense to be very good. I expect them to be okay at best. They did do a lot to address their cornerback room and beef up that defensive line. So I think there's a chance that that defense is better than people think it will be, but I still don't think it's going to be a great defense by any means. So moving on to number 14, and that is Patrick Queen, linebacker of the Baltimore Ravens. And my biggest concern with him is Patrick Queen had no problem making impact plays last year. And that's all fine and dandy. But when it comes down to it, like what happened was he'd have games where he had 3 to 4 like impact plays, whether it was, tackles for loss, sacks, interceptions, quarterback hits, whatever the case is where he impacted the play. But there were games outside of that where he just did nothing outside of get tackles. And I think my big issue with if he can't bring up that tackle floor, you're going to be looking at a guy who's not very consistent and has huge boom games, and you're going to feel so good about those boom games. But in leagues where tackle settings are not that high and not rewarded, you're going to be looking at low scoring games like 2 to 3 points. And I think you're going to be a little upset with yourself unless you have him paired with, hypothetically, like a Darius Leonard, he's your LB2 with your LB1, something like that. I think you'd be a little more content with. And then because those big boom weeks will win you weeks, but those low weeks, that could really hurt, and the last time you want those to hit, obviously playoffs, where, say you end up with a 3 point playoff week from your, supposed to be LB2, not going to be a great feeling. So somebody I'm kind of risk averse to, not my play style. I just think that, if you like a guy that can do that, go get this guy. And if you think he can raise his tackle floor, go do that. But I'm just somebody who's not as sold on Patrick Queen in that respect. So somebody who I'm kind of out on, but I do respect him in my rankings because I do think he has a ton of upside. I mean, nearly all the upside in the world if he can bring up that tackle floor and get more involved with tackling. But, if he does that sacrifice some of his big play upside? That's a whole other conversation for another day. Moving on to number 15, and that's Joey Bosa, D end of the Los Angeles Chargers. Probably would be my D end one if he didn't have so many injury concerns. And this is just, I think Joey Bosa is really stinking good. When he's on the field and healthy, he is the same way you can just change a game and, change your week essentially. A guy who you can draft as your D end one and feel pretty confident if he's healthy. So he's a guy who, in some leagues, depending if I've gone like risk averse, for I need to be a little safer, I'm going to pivot to somebody else who I think is a little more healthy and I'm not as much of, doesn't have that same weighted concern where it just always seems like there's a nagging injury that's not usually, I wouldn't say it keeps him off the field, but I do think it limits him. And I think if he's playing a game, you're not going to sit him. Last year when he had his big monster blow up game and he sacked Josh Allen 6 times, felt like it definitely wasn't 6 times, but when he had that big blow up game, he was questionable going into the week. He was limited in practice all week. A lot of people sat him because they were worried, A, the Bills weren't a good matchup, and then B, they were worried that he might not even play the whole game. So it's one of those things where I like him and I think he does well overall in the season. I just think there's going to be those weeks where either he's sitting out because of a nagging toe injury, he's sitting out because of a nagging knee injury, whatever, or his back's acting up, whatever the case is. I think there might be weeks like that, but the weeks where he plays and he's going to be healthy are going to be weeks where you want to start him and you want him on your team, and you're going to be sad if he's not. Him and Patrick Queen are kind of two guys that are in the same nutshell for me. Like if I'm in an IDP best ball, which is a thing, by the way, get on sleeper, pretty awesome. But if I'm in an IDP best ball, These are guys I'd love to have because when they're having their low weeks, they're going to be on the bench where they belong. When they're having their boom weeks, they're going to be in my starting lineup. So moving on to number 16 here, and that is Shaq Barrett, another player with a bit of a caveat. Essentially see TJ Watt. Very, very much of the positional designation really is going to matter unless your scoring settings are friendly. I will say that like IDP 123, and not to like just harp on a scoring setting, but because score your settings however you want. But IDP 123 does a great job of leveling out a linebacker on one platform to a DL on another. Say if he's a linebacker only on MFL, but he's a DL slash linebacker on Sleeper, their end of season rankings are going to be pretty similar. Whereas other scoring settings get all wonky, and he's like the LB 50 in one league, but he's a DL 10 in another. Whereas with this scoring setting, it pans out a little better. I will link in the description box below an article that describes IDP 123 scoring. Check it out if you're interested. There's no need to feel any pressure to do so, but just something to check out for you guys if you are interested, since I have brought it up a couple times, and that'll lay it out a little better than I can in this video, which is just supposed to be about rankings. Moving on to number 17, and that is Chase Young, defensive end for the Washington football team. Can I just say that I think it's awesome that they're finally coming out with a team name, and one of the finalists is Washington football team. And honestly, it might have my vote. I think I voted for the Red Wolves or Red Hogs. I think we need some pig representation in the league for one, but this is just a guy who I think is going to be an ascending talent and somebody you really want in your dynasty leagues. As I know he didn't have a perfect season last year. Keep in mind he was dealing with a nagging injury all season. Got hurt in like week 2 and wasn't really feeling fully healthy till like week 6 or 7. And God knows if that's even really fully healthy. These NFL players will put up with a lot of pain to stay on the field and keep their paychecks coming. So he's coming in at 2021 fully healthy. He's got a wrecking crew of a defensive line behind him, just a slew of first round picks. Him, Montez Sweat, Daron Payne, Jonathan Allen, you name it. Just a absolute wrecking crew and a nightmare for opposing quarterbacks. All right, so now we are moving on to number 18, and probably one of the most, I don't want to say controversial, but definitely one of the more interesting talking points of this entire video. And that's Jalen Smith, number 18 linebacker of the Dallas Cowboys. And the reason why I say it's interesting is because they've done some wonky things with that defense. And what I mean is, so they have Keanu Neal, formerly of the Falcons, listed as a linebacker, and that's how he's on every depth chart. That's how he's on MFL, and MFL is pretty good about labeling where players are stacked up, like legitimately. So the fact is, they have Neal at linebacker. They just drafted Parsons at linebacker. Then they have Leighton Vander Esch. So they have 4 possible starting linebackers and 3 starting linebacker spots. And I'm just not really a fan of that situation. Micah Parsons would be somebody I have higher if I knew that like he's going to be the main guy. He's currently listed as their strong side starting linebacker according to Our Lads, which is not always super accurate because they're not always super up to date. So keep that in mind. Whereas Jalen Smith is listed as the starting middle linebacker and Keanu Neal is the backup middle linebacker, which I think is interesting. And then at weak side, they have Leighton Vander Esch, who I think if anybody needs a backup behind him, it's Leighton Vander Esch, who hasn't been able to stay healthy the last 2 seasons he's been in the league. So what is going on in Dallas? Who knows? And this is something where, like, I know a lot of people will still have Jalen Smith in the top 10. And I think Jalen Smith is a good player. When I'm being told or when I'm seeing that Leighton Vander Esch and Jalen Smith are coming out with the second teams in practice, as opposed to Micah Parsons and Keanu Neal getting first team reps in practice. That just kind of waves a red flag for me. And again, I usually tend to play pretty risk averse, especially when you have to draft a guy high. So I'm ranking him low in hopes of kind of just ranking him out of where you might draft him. He's somebody I'm avoiding. I have him in leagues and dynasty leagues that I'm kind of trying to offload shares if I can. But real tough to sell right now with that murky situation. I'm hoping maybe he has a good week 1 and I can sell him then and just get out of that situation. So again, IDP 18, just somebody I'm not big on that situation. I'm just not a huge fan of it. Playing scared doesn't usually get you anywhere, but it can get you out of bad situations sometimes. So moving on to number 19, and that is Nick Bosa, another injury-prone Bosa brother at the end. And, injury concerns, had stuff coming into his rookie season, towards ACL last year, coming back from an ACL. I will say he seems good to go. Seems fine in practice, doesn't seem limited at all. So huge pluses there. I don't know what that defense is going to look like without Robert Saleh. A big concern for me is people who, still draft defenses for one, but people that are drafting defenses, drafting San Fran pretty highly. And while they were a good defense last year, and they still have a lot of the same pieces, I don't know how good they're going to be with Robert Saleh out of the building, unless he has like a direct disciple that's still there behind him. I'm not really sold on that defense being all that great. And while that doesn't necessarily link directly to Nick Bosa's production, I think he's just still an absolute wrecking ball and terror for opposing offensive linemen and quarterbacks. But it is a bit of a concern. It knocks him down for me. Still a pretty highly rated DL in my book, but something I'm just kind of keeping an eye on again is those injury concerns and how he's going to bounce back from that ACL tear, and just kind of see how it goes from there. Then we got a number 20, and that is Deion Jones, linebacker of the Atlanta Falcons. And again, I don't like to necessarily buy into the bad defense equals good IDP, but Deion Jones is a good IDP in a bad defense, and they did very little to rectify that defense this offseason. They bring in Richie Grant. They did almost nothing to address the defensive line, which was one of the worst in the league last year. And for me, I just have a tough time getting behind that defense being anything great. So in games where he's been on the field for a lot of plays, he has the conditioning to do it, and he's had monster games when he's been on the field for a long time. I will say I don't think it's necessarily going to be a lot of running going against the Atlanta Falcons. I think their offense is going to be good enough to keep them in games, but I still think that defense is just not going to be good. They're not going to be able to get off the field consistently. I'm in on Deion Jones every year. He's a pretty dang good player, playmaker, tackler. Pretty much does it all, everything you want to do as a linebacker. And again, I just think that bad defense just contributes to him being a good player this year. Moving on to number 21, formerly number 21, Jeremy Chin, probably my favorite IDP player in general, if I'm being totally honest. He's a guy last year, I scouted him as a DB, and like he was just that guy that I'm like, this guy's going to be good. And thank God he was, otherwise it would have looked horrible. But no, I was big on Jeremy Chin last year, big on him this year. Another thing to note, that positional designation, there was chatter of him being switched to just a linebacker, and that would not be great for his IDP outlook as a safety, obviously, because he does play more of a traditional box safety. So he does play a lot in like a linebacker safety hybrid role, and that's why he gets to keep that designation in sleeper, is because he plays both. He does. While he spends a lot of the time in the box, he still is technically a safety. So thankfully for that, we don't have to worry about designation change yet. However, it is something to monitor and something that could be changed at the drop of the hat without much notice or warning or anything like that. But I don't see any reason why in that defense he can't continue to, get even better. I think he's listed as my safety 3, which is a little crazy and a little over the top. But again, it's a my guy situation. I just believe in him, and I'm really looking forward to watching him this year again in Carolina and see what he can do in year 2. So probably another guy I'm lower on than a lot of people, and that's Tremaine Edmonds at number 22. And he's just not really a huge playmaker. He has a safe tackle for. He's had 100 tackles in all of his 3 seasons so far, heading into another year where he should have another 100 tackles. But, in 3 years, he's had 5.5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 0 since 2018. He's had 3 interceptions, and, he might just be what he is. I will say that he's only 22, so he's still young. He could be catching that playmaker bug yet. I will say in college, he was a playmaker. I comped Micah Parsons to Tremaine Edmonds. I don't know. It's a guy, I think I have him in a league or two. And I'm just like, if anybody offered me anything worthwhile for him, I'd probably trade him away just because I'm not a huge Edmonds believer. I just think I do lean towards that, the fact that he is kind of what he is. He's not bad by any means. It's just not a player I'm really excited to watch, in my opinion. So I'm like I said, I think I'm probably lower on him than most. I think my ranking of him is still pretty respectable. So moving on to number 23, and that is Kenneth Murray, linebacker of the Los Angeles Chargers. And I think my favorite thing about Kenneth Murray is I think he's going to get 100% thrown into the Wolves this year. And I think my favorite part of that is Brandon Staley coming in as the new head coach, the guy who led the Los Angeles Rams defense last year to be the number 1 defense in the league, and made Micah Kaiser and Troy Reeder into good linebackers. And I don't want to disparage those two at all, but they're not anywhere near the athletic or the production profile that Kenneth Murray had at Alabama. I don't think there's any reason that Kenneth Murray in year 2 can't push to be in that LB1 conversation under the tutelage of Brandon Staley, who, like I said, made Troy Reader and Micah Kaiser into good linebackers. So I don't see why he can't also just then, in turn, make a good linebacker really great. Moving on to number 24 and our final guy, Levante David, another guy who is kind of aging out of his prime, in my opinion, but it seemed to age kind of like a fine wine. He's still been really dang good, really productive, kind of in all facets of the ball. Had some injury concerns last year, but part of arguably the best linebacker duo in the league, drafting him as a mid to late LB2. Again, that age thing is going to be a guy or going to make it so you can probably get him at a decent value more often than not. And for that, take that for what it's worth and run. That is it for my top 24 IDP rankings for 2021 fantasy football. I do hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy, please leave a like. Check out these other videos on the channel. Get ready for your drafts. And then if you're new to IDP, you should check out this video here. But that is it for me today. I do hope y'all enjoyed. Have a good one.